Hello and welcome to my next video in the Learn to Code series. So here behind me I have this nice little picture. I have an image caption right below here. And I have this, which is just a nice little greeting card. And this tutorial is going to go through that example code, how it works and how you can change it. This is all available on the GitHub repository, the example repository, which I will link below. It's in the HTML and CSS folder, and it is greetingcard.html. So if you've downloaded the zip file and you've unzipped it, you can find it in HTML and CSS. Or you can click here, get all this code, copy it, paste it, and be ready to go. For the editor, I will be using Notepad++. I will provide a link below to download that if you'd like. You can just use Notepad. Notepad is perfectly fine. This will provide some highlighting and some coloring. So if you go to the website, it will provide you with a download link over here in the corner. And you can download the version that is right for you, 32-bit or 64-bit. I believe there is a Mac version available. If not, then again, you can use any standard text editor. That should be fine. So I have the file all loaded up, but the first thing you'll notice is, this text is a little bit hard to read. And also the background is white and the text is black. And if you stare at a screen for a really long time, that means your eyes get bombarded with white light. So really you want to find a dark-based scheme that's kind of the dark background and a light foreground. It's a lot more relaxing on your eyes and it's actually easier to read. So the way you change that is under Settings. You go to Style Configurator. And there's a whole bunch of predefined ones. I think Blackboard is going to be pretty good. And for fonts, there's a whole bunch of fonts. You can pick one that suits your needs. Okay, so let's dive right in. So up here I have a comment. The comment talks about what the example is. The points back to the GitHub repository. This, as I've stated previously, comments are ignored. So this comment here is just for you, and it's just for me. The browser will do nothing. It will completely ignore it. It is completely useless when it comes to that. I have my title, which is greeting card. We have the styles, which I'm going to get into last, even though it appears first. So we scroll down. It seems like a lot, but there's actually, I'd say about half of that is comments. So we have our body. I really have some good comments. I'm not going to walk through the comments because I trust you can read. And I don't think you want to be simply read to. So what I'm here is creating a structure. So I'm creating a div, which is a division. And as you see, things kind of highlight. That is one of the good things about using a fancy editor like Notepad++ or something called an IDE, an integrated development environment. If you're using regular Notepad, those things won't happen, but it's not that necessary. It's not necessary. It's just helpful. So I give this an ID. So IDs are you're giving something a unique identifier, and that means that this and only this on this page will be that name. So I'm going to call it the greeting card. So we're going to only have one on the page. And this greeting card is going to have a top half. So this is the start tag and this is the end tag. So everything in here is the top half. And then I'll have a bottom half. So for these, I used a class. Now, I could have used an ID because I only have one top half and one bottom half. But I wanted to show a different example as to how classes work versus IDs. Class names do not have to be unique. And something can have multiple class names. So this could be top half rounded. So that would be two classes. One would be top half and the next would be rounded. So then I have another div, which is the image. Now I've named it image, which I guess could be a little bit confusing because there's an actual image tag below. But this is, I'm calling it's really the top part of the image. And I wanted to group the image and the text together so they display appropriately. So I have the image here and I have the image caption text. So this is my image caption here text. And we have this image, and this image, if I scroll to the right, has something called an alt tag. Alt tags are very important for accessibility. So for anyone who has is using a screen reader, anyone who has is visually impaired, or just a search engine, will use this alt text to figure out what this image is and describe it. We go to the bottom, we have a bottom half, we have an H1 tag, we have greetings from me, and then 2 paragraph tags, which have paragraph content, and then a signature. So if we go back over to our browser and we take a look at what that looks like, this is what we get. So we have that image, we have the image caption here, we have the greetings, we have our 2 paragraphs, and then we have our signature. So what I first want to talk about is the image, because the hope for this is that you can sit here, you can customize this, and you can create your own greeting card to send to somebody. So I've gone to free-images.com, which is a public domain image search engine, and I searched, and this is what I found, and this is a nice image. So I'm going to right click on it. You can't see because that doesn't show up. And I'm going to go to copy image location. I'm going to go back to my editor. I'm going to go back to where my image was. I'm going to change the source. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to paste in a new image. This is apparently the Cyclopean Isles in Sicily, Italy. I'm going to save this. So file, save. I'm going to go back and I'm going to reload my page. Here it is. So you can change the image to whatever you want. If you'd like to personalize and may use one of your own images, if you use a service like Dropbox or Google Drive, they will let you get an image location directly from the service itself. And as a note, if you have a file on your local computer or on your phone, you won't be able to directly link to it and send that in an email. You could include the email itself. So if the image is directly in the same folder as the HTML file, then you can just include it by including the actual name of the file. So that is a possibility. So we've changed that. So now let's take a little bit of a look at the CSS behind all of this and how that works. So if I scroll all the way back up and I look at the CSS, I'm going to quickly change the highlighting so that it's a little bit easier to see. Comments are now in light gray, so it's a little more obvious that there's a lot of comments here that I'm kind of ignoring because they explain things. So the first thing I've done is added an import. So the standard web browser only has a few fonts that it supports. It supports serif fonts, sans serif. Serif means it has the little lines at the bottom and top of at the bottom of every character, so they're easier to draw a line with. Sans serif means it doesn't have those. And it has a few other little basics, but if you want anything that looks really nice, like our cursive, which I used for the signature and I used for the caption, then you have to include them. Google has a really cool service called Google Fonts, which allows you to utilize a whole bunch of public domain and freely available fonts. And it will actually give you this code, this import code. And I have instructions up here. So I'm importing 2 fonts. One is called Dancing Script, and the other one is called Open Sans. Open Sans is just a little bit nicer and cleaner than the defaults, and Dancing Script is the nice little cursive. So the first selector. So in CSS, the way CSS works is you have selectors and styles. And selectors do exactly what they sound like. They select something. And the styles style that thing. So in this case, we are using the pound or hashtag greeting card. So this says anything with the ID of greeting card is going to have this styles. So the style I've put in is margin top and margin bottom, setting them to 32 pixels. When you're defining size, you have a few options, and everything is based off of screen. So a screen has pixels, and pixels are the little kind of tiny dots on the screen. So a large monitor, a desktop monitor, has a lot of pixels, whereas a phone has a smaller set number of pixels. It's pretty standard to define things in terms of pixels, but you can also use percentages. So you could say 50%, so it would define 50% of the window. There's also a few other measurements like EM. You can even put IN for inches. So there's a lot more if you want to dig into that. I recommend using pixels and percentages. That's the easiest way to go to start. And the second is a margin left and a margin right of auto. So auto means whatever's left. And when you do a margin left and a margin right of auto, what that does is center something. I then have a width of 75%. So that means I want my greeting card to be 75% of the window. So if the window gets bigger, then the card gets bigger. If the window gets smaller, the card gets smaller. And I've also added a max width of 720. So that means if I take my screen and make it really, really wide, I don't want the card to get really huge. So if someone's got a big monitor, I don't want it to affect, I don't want it to get too large. So I set a max width. So the same works for minimums as well. You can do min dash width or height and set a minimum. So you can kind of control how things would look on different devices. I've then added a box shadow. So a box shadow, for anyone who's familiar with photo editing, there's a big thing called a drop shadow. So a drop shadow basically just adds a nice shadow effect around something. So this is defining a box shadow, so a shadow around the box. So I have 4 parameters. I do explain in more detail what's going on here in the comments, but the 4 parameters define the size, the blur radius, their offset, and then the last number, and this is really critical to understand, is something called an RGBA, which is the red, green, blue, and alpha. Red is how much red color you want in it. Green is how much green color you want in it. Blue is how much blue you want. And alpha is how transparent. So 0, 0, 0 for red, green, blue creates black. The highest number you can go is 255. So 255, 255, 255 is white. You don't need to memorize what numbers equate to what colors in the sense of, if you wanted magenta, you wouldn't have to memorize that. There's a whole bunch of, just search for RGBA color picker into Google or anything else, and you'll find a whole bunch of interactive pages that allow you to do a color picker. So in this case, it's black with a 2.2 opacity. So that's a 20% opacity. And then the last I have is a transition, and I'll explain that a little later. So we'll quickly go back and let's take a look at how that is. So in this case, my width is 720 pixels. It has gone beyond its maximum. So it's, as you see, it's not 75%. If I make the window smaller, as you see, at some point, it will. So now it's at 75%. So it's resizing appropriately. But once it has reached its 720 pixels, then it's going to stay where it is. And it has the margin up top, and it has a margin down below. So if I were to make this smaller, it would have a margin. And it's also centered. So you see the margin left and margin right auto. So that explains and shows what those do. So you can change any of these when you have this locally, and you can play and you can see how that changes things. So transition is a slightly newer property, but what it does is it actually affects a little bit of kind of how things change. So what this says is whenever there is a change to an attribute, have it happen in 0.3 seconds. So it's fairly quick. And right below that, I have something called greeting card : hover. So a hover is a certain type of action selector that is triggered when an action happens. So in this case, I am changing the box shadow to have go from 4 pixels to 8, from 8 to 16, and it keeps the same color. If I go back and I put my mouse over it, it's a subtle effect, but you can see that the background, so if you look down at the bottom here, you can see when the mouse goes over, the effect becomes larger. So if I were to take this, and let's say I want this to be red. So if I change that, save, and I reload. See, the one thing with HTML is every time you make a change, you have to reload the page. If I reload, now you'll see this has a bit of a red color to it. All right, so let me put that back to black and save. All right, so now let's go a little further. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select different things and change their styles. So in this case, I'm starting with the greeting card ID. And then if you have a space and another selector, what you're saying is I want something that's within. So in this case, I want the image caption text, and a period means class. So whereas the hashtag means ID, the period means class. So I want image caption text in the greeting card, and that's what I'm going to style. So just so we can quickly remind ourselves, we have image caption text here. Go back to the code. We have image caption text. So we have a class that's equal to image caption text. So our image caption text, so the first thing is we want to define the font. So I go font family, colon. So in CSS, when you want to set a property, because that's really what you're doing, you use a colon. So font family, colon, and then in quotes, dancing script. Now I don't have to have this next part. Comma cursive basically says if you can't find the dancing script, then use the cursive, the default cursive font in the browser. So this is optional, but I have it in here as a fallback. So the next thing I need to do is I need to move it. So if I didn't tell the browser where to put the text would start at the top left. It kind of works like a standard note would if you were writing. Start at the top left, and when you start a new line, it's right below it and things like that. So the first thing I want to do is I want to position it absolutely. So when I do an absolute position, that means I want to tell the browser exactly where it needs to go. So I'm going to set the bottom to 10 pixels and the right to 10 pixels. So that takes the bottom of this box and the right of this box and puts them 10 pixels away from the corner. Everything in HTML is a box. So even though there is text here, and even though I can select it, this text is part of a box. So everything is in there, and the positioning and size is called the box model. Okay, so I get to define a color. So in this case, I do RGB. So this is very similar to the RGBA, but it doesn't have an alpha. So in here I did 180.00, which is basically a slightly darker red. You can change this to obviously anything you want. So I set my font size, which is how large the font is going to be, and I set my font weight. So font weight is how thick your font is going to be. So if you've ever made text bold, you're changing the font weight. You can use words, so you can have normal, bold, and I believe there's a few other keywords. But if you want to get very granular, you do them in direct numbers. So 100 would be very thin, 300 is normal, and 600 is bold. And I believe you can go all the way up to 900, which would be like really fat balloon letters. And then the last thing I added was a text shadow. So a text shadow is very similar to a box shadow, except it's a shadow around the text. So you define your X offset, your Y offset, and then your color. And I chose, in this case, to have a white. So 255, 255, 255 is white, and with about a 30%, well, with it exactly 30% opacity. So if we go back, so all of this is what styles and creates the image caption here. So the font size is fairly large, 36 pixels. It's got a white shadow to it. You can't really tell, but it allows it to be a lot more readable. Given that this new image is very light, a darker shadow might make it more readable. Now we want to make the image within that top half. We want to size it appropriately because it might be larger, it might be smaller, so we want to scale it. So we take the greeting card image in that classed div image and then image. So the IMG. So if you don't have a period or a pound sign, that means a tag. So in this case, we're taking the image tag and setting the width to 100. Here we have the greeting card top half. So this says anything in this ID greeting card with the class top half, give it a position relative. Now this is required to make, and I put this in the comments, this is required to make the position absolute work correctly. This gets really, really complicated when you get into absolute positioning, relative positioning in relation to potentially other objects. But I will try to simplify as much as I can. When you absolutely position something, its reference point is the most recent relative item it is contained within. So I realize that is a lot to digest. So the most important thing is if you want to position something absolutely, put it in something positioned relative. As you play with things like that more, you'll start to get a feel more. You can dive more into the topic and get more about it. But really, that's kind of all you need to know. It's one line of code. There's absolutely nothing wrong with putting in one line of code that you don't understand why it works or how it works, but if it works, it's fine. So the greeting card bottom half, I set the font family to Open Sans. If I wanted to change that to dancing script and make it all look cursive, I could do that as well. And then I added something called a padding. So above with the greeting card, I used a margin. Margin is the amount of space outside of the box that I want to give. So that kind of separates it from something else. Whereas padding is the space within the box you want to give before the content starts. All right, so I'm going to quickly show you what that looks like. So here we have margin, and margin is the text as the space outside. Whereas inside we have padding, which is the space between this edge and the content itself. All right, so we have our greeting card bottom half P. So this is styling our paragraph tags. And very basic, all I have is a text indent of 24 pixels. So quickly going back, you can take a look. Each new paragraph tag, the first line is indented 24 pixels. And the last thing I have is the greeting card signature. So here I have the dancing script, and I'm aligning the text on the right, and I'm setting the font size to be 24, so it's going to be a little bit bigger. So at this point, that is all the styling you need, and that's all the HTML. So you can go in here and you can edit, you can create your own image, you can add paragraphs, you can take paragraphs out, you can play with all of this. And I would love if anyone does create something, if they want to take a screenshot and share that, that would be great. If you want to, however you want to share it. So I would love to see. But this is the final creation, and I hope you've enjoyed. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please put them in the comments down below, and subscribe if you'd like to be notified of new videos as they come out. And also in the description below, I will have a link to the repository as well as any other resources that I've used during this video. So thank you so much, and I will see you all next time.